All right, so let's dive right in. We're talking startup ideas today, and I mean, who hasn't dreamt about stumbling on that like $1 million idea,
It's
right?
a dream.
Totally. And to help us unpack this whole world, we're going deep on Paul Graham's essay, Ideas for Startups.
Oh, he's a great one to listen to for sure.
He really gets into the weeds, and he was actually giving this as a talk, which I think makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, it's like we're right there at the startup school thing back in 2005.
Exactly. So Graham just throws out this idea early on that, like, you don't need $1 million idea right off the bat. It's kind of freeing.
It is, he's basically saying it's more about the journey.
So it's not about having like this perfectly formed $1 billion unicorn from day one.
Nope. More like planting a seed. You nurture it, you see where it grows, you're open to, maybe it ends up looking totally different than you expected.
That's so true. Think about how many successful companies pivoted, right? Like they started with one thing, but ended up somewhere completely different.
Oh, absolutely. Look at, I'm trying to think of a really obvious one.
Oh, I know. Wasn't Instagram originally supposed to be some kind of location check-in app or something?
Yes, something like that. See, that's exactly what Graham is talking about.
That's where things get really interesting because then he goes on to suggest that instead of thinking about startup ideas as like declarations, we should be thinking about them as questions.
It's brilliant when you think about it.
Okay, so break that down for me. Why questions?
Well, okay, think about it. When you ask a question, you're not putting yourself out there like you have all the answers, right? It's less like I'm right and more like, I wonder.
I see, so it's less defensive.
Exactly. So instead of saying I'm going to build a web-based spreadsheet, it's more like could someone make a collaborative web-based spreadsheet? Would that even work?
I'm picking up what you're putting down. It just opens up the possibilities.
Yes. And this is where environment comes in. Like, imagine you're surrounded by people who are asking those kinds of questions, who are, tinkering and experimenting.
Graham talks a lot about universities being these really fertile grounds for ideas, right?
Yeah, he does. And I think it makes sense, right? You've got access to cutting edge research. You're surrounded by like these really smart, curious people. It's like this constant exchange of ideas.
So different from being like, stuck in a big company that's just focused on their existing products and stuff.
Night and day. And Graham actually compares idea generation to this process of doodling.
Doodling. Okay, now that sounds kind of random.
I know, right? But hear him out. He's not talking about like mindless scribbling. He's talking about making these unexpected connections. Like you're taking all these different mental models, all these things and you're just kind of playing with them, seeing how they fit together in new ways.
So it's not that the ideas themselves are random. It's more about the process of discovering those connections. That's kind of like doodling.
Exactly. It's like he says, sometimes the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. And some of those are going to come from just, messing around.
That's so true. It reminds me of this one time we were trying to come up with a name for a new product line, and we were just like throwing out the most ridiculous ideas, right? And then someone said something totally off the wall, and it sparked this whole chain reaction.
Hmm.
We ended up with the perfect name, totally unexpected.
There you go. You see, sometimes you got to play around a little, right? Get those creative juices flowing. And Graham actually takes this idea of unexpected connections even further. He says that oftentimes the best startup ideas come from tackling problems, like really leaning into the things that bug us.
Yeah, it's so funny because it feels so counterintuitive, right? Like our instinct is to avoid problems,
Mm.
not run towards them.
Right. Like if something's broken, we try to ignore it or we just kind of muddle through. But Graham's saying, no, pay attention to those frustrations, like those moments when you're like, ugh, there has to be a better way to do this. That's where the good stuff is hiding.
So true. He talks about spam filters,
Yeah.
right? Like back in the day when email was just becoming this huge thing and everyone was getting slammed with spam.
Exactly. It was a huge pain point. And Graham realized that if he could find a way to solve that problem, to like actually make spam filters work, it would be huge. And look what happened. He built a whole company around it.
Amazing. Okay, but let's be real for a second. Not all problems are created equal, right? Like some are just annoying, and then some are like, this is $1 billion problem waiting to be solved.
Totally. But the thing is, you don't always know right away which is which. Sometimes those smaller, seemingly annoying problems can actually be entry points to much bigger things. Like, remember we were talking about Henry Ford earlier?
The Model T guy.
Yes. So before Ford came along, cars were like this luxury, right? Only rich people could afford them. But Ford realized that if he could find a way to mass produce cars to make them more affordable, well, you know the rest of the story.
It's incredible. He didn't just create a car company. He, like, changed the whole freaking world.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the cost, right? It's about how that simplification, that accessibility opens up all these new possibilities. Think about how frustrating it is to use some of those old clunky banking apps, you
Oh,
know?
tell me about it. Half the time I can't even remember my password.
Yeah, actually. Now imagine if you had a banking app that was so intuitive, so easy to use, that it actually made managing your money
Oh
enjoyable.
my gosh, that would be life-changing.
Right. And it all goes back to that idea of taking something complex and making it radically simple.
Which, by the way, is something that Graham talks about a lot. He's, like, obsessed with making things easier to use.
Because it matters. How many times have you given up on using some new gadget or app because it was just too complicated?
Oh, all the time. I mean, my stove has an error message that pops up, like, every other day. I have no idea what it means.
You see, that's what we're talking about. Good technology should just disappear, it should just work. And that's not always easy to achieve.
No, it definitely takes a certain kind of genius to make things that simple. Like, Apple products. They just work.
Right. And that's not an accident. That's the result of a lot of really thoughtful design, a deep understanding of how people actually use technology. And it's not just about technology either, right? I mean, this principle applies to so many things in life.
Oh, absolutely. Like how we communicate with each other, how we design our living spaces, how we organize our work. Simplicity is key.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about a lot here. We've got the myth of the $1 million idea, the power of questions, the magic of doodling, leaning into problems, making things ridiculously easy to use.
Don't forget turning luxuries into commodities.
Oh, right. See, we're already thinking like startup founders. But there's one more big idea from Graham's essay that I want to make sure we touch on before we move on, and it's a big one. Most startups don't actually end up building empires. They get acquired.
It's funny, isn't it? Like, we have this image in our minds of the lone entrepreneur building a company from scratch, taking on the world. But the reality is, most of the time, that's not how it plays out.
Exactly. And Graham challenges that traditional startup narrative, you know? He's like, hey, maybe being acquired isn't a failure. Maybe it's a strategic win.
Especially when you consider the resources and the reach that a larger company can bring to the table.
Yeah.
Like, you might have this amazing product, but getting it out there, scaling it to millions of users, that takes a lot of firepower.
A lot. And that's where being part of a bigger company can be a game changer. You're tapping into their existing infrastructure, their marketing muscle, their distribution channels. It can really help take things to the next level.
Okay, but let's say we embrace this idea of building for acquisition.
Hmm.
Does that change how we approach building a startup? Like, is it something we should be thinking about from day one?
Hmm.
It's almost like instead of building a house to live in forever, you're building it with the intention of selling it down the line.
Kinda. And, like you'd make different choices if you were building a house to sell, right? You'd think about what buyers in that neighborhood are looking for.
So it's all about being strategic, understanding the market you're in.
Exactly. And Graham actually gives this like really practical tip. He says, try to build something that multiple companies would want to acquire.
Okay, so not just like one super niche buyer, but something with broader appeal.
Right. Because when you have multiple potential buyers, it creates this like, competition.
Oh, I get it. It's like bidding on that house. If you've got multiple people interested, you're going to get a better price.
Exactly. So by thinking about acquisition early on, you're not just increasing your chances of like, getting acquired.
You're also potentially increasing your payout.
Yes. And you might even have more control over which company you end up working with. Like you can choose the one that's the best fit for you and your team.
Okay, so that's building for acquisition. Got it.
Yeah.
But it's funny because, like, we've been talking about all these strategic things, right? But then Graham ends the essay on this really interesting note. He talks about those accidental success stories like Apple and Yahoo, those companies that weren't necessarily trying to build empires from day one.
Right. They were just like messing around with ideas that they were passionate about.
Like the woes, right? Just building cool stuff in his garage.
Exactly. The woes. And it's so inspiring because it reminds us that sometimes, the best stuff comes from that pure joy of creation. You're not overthinking it. You're just like following your curiosity.
It's like that whole constraints breed creativity thing, right?
Yeah.
When you're not bogged down by all the expectations and the pressure, that's when the magic happens.
100%. It's about remembering to have fun,
Yeah.
to play around, to experiment. Because you never know where those explorations might lead you.
This has been such a great deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground, from those really practical tips on building a startup to those bigger picture ideas about innovation and creativity.
And challenging those assumptions, right? Like maybe you don't need $1 million idea after all.
Maybe you just need to be paying attention to the problems around you, those little annoyances, the things that make you go, there's got to be a better way.
Or maybe you just need to carve out some time to tinker, to play around with some ideas that have been rattling around in your head.
Exactly. So for anyone listening who's ever felt that pressure to come up with that next big thing, maybe the real key is to just let go a little.
Follow your curiosity.
Build something you're passionate about.
Don't be afraid to experiment.
And who knows, maybe that side project you've been working on, that problem you're obsessed with solving, maybe that's the seed of something truly game-changing.
You never know. You know, when you think about startup ideas, you think like sleek, user-friendly, instant hit, right?
Right.
But what if I told you the ideas with the most potential? They're actually kind of repulsive at first.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And that's exactly what we're diving into today with Paul Graham's frighteningly ambitious startup ideas. So get ready, because these aren't like your typical app concepts.
No, not at all.
Ugh.
We're talking big, potentially world-changing stuff here. It's fascinating how our brains work, you
Yeah.
know. We tend to shy away from things that seem too big, too radical. Like, it's almost an instinct to protect our own sense of what's possible, you know.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. But how does that play out with like startups specifically?
Well, imagine someone pitches you an idea,
Yeah.
and it's so out there, so different from anything you've ever encountered, that your immediate reaction is just to recoil.
Oh, I've been there.
Right. It's like Graham says, and I love this quote, he's quoting being John Malkovich. He says, if you ever got me, you wouldn't have a clue what to do with me. These big ideas, they challenge our whole understanding of how things work.
So you're saying if my brain is going, no way, that's crazy, that could actually be a good sign.
Exactly. That fear factor, that's a huge advantage for anyone brave enough to actually listen to it, because most people, they won't even consider those ideas, let alone actually act on them.
It's like they're leaving the field wide open for the few who are like daring enough to be different.
Exactly. It's about leaning into that initial discomfort,
Yeah.
you know, and seeing it not as a warning sign, but as a signpost pointing towards uncharted territory, towards breakthroughs, towards innovation.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal of a little fear factor now. So instead of seeing those big, scary ideas as impossible, we should be seeing them as like opportunities.
Absolutely. That's the spirit. Now, you ready to dive into some of these repulsive yet kind of brilliant ideas that Graham proposed?
I'm so ready. Hit me with it.
All right, let's start with a big one, a brand new search engine.
Okay, I know taking on Google sounds about as appealing as like challenging a tiger to a tickle fight, but
Right.
but seriously, Google is so deeply ingrained in our lives. How could anyone even begin to compete with that?
And that's where things get really interesting. See, Graham suggests, instead of taking them head on, focus on a smaller group. An incredibly influential group that Google, despite its vastness, might be overlooking, the top 10,000 hackers.
Okay, now when you say hackers, you're not talking about teenagers in hoodies trying to steal credit card numbers, right?
No, no, no. Think more like the elite programmers,
Yeah.
the ones who live and breathe code, constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible with technology.
Okay, so if you can build a search engine that caters specifically to their needs, their very specific, very technical needs, you might be onto something. But how do you even begin to do that?
Well, Graham throws out this idea, making search queries Turing complete.
Okay, now you're just using words I don't understand.
Right, it sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
Yeah.
But essentially, it means giving users the ability to write incredibly complex search queries, almost like programming the search engine itself.
So instead of just typing in keywords, you're basically writing like mini programs to pinpoint exactly what you need. That's mind-blowing. But I can see how that would appeal to those elite programmers you mentioned.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of Graham's approach. He's not talking about building a slightly better Google. He's talking about creating something entirely new, something that caters to the needs of a small but incredibly influential group. And who knows, maybe that small niche product could eventually disrupt the entire internet.
All right, so we've tackled conquering the internet one complex search query at a time. What other digital behemoths is Graham setting his sights on?
Get ready for this one, because he's coming after something we all love to hate, email.
Oh man, he's going for the jugular, isn't he? But I have to admit, the thought of a world without endless email chains, it's oddly appealing. But how do you even begin to replace something so deeply ingrained in our lives?
It's not about just like deleting our inboxes.
Although I kind of like the sound of that.
Right. But Graham's insight is that email's fundamental flaw, it's a case of mistaken identity. We treat it like a messaging app,
Yeah.
but it's actually a terrible, terrible to-do list.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it. My inbox is like this monster that I'm constantly battling. How many times have you opened an email, thought, okay, yeah, I'll deal with that later, and then completely forgotten about it until the sender sends a passive-aggressive, just checking in, reply?
All the time.
Yeah.
It's the worst, right? That constant context switching, that feeling of like never reaching inbox zero, it's just a recipe for stress and inefficiency.
Hmm.
So Graham's solution, it's pretty radical. Design a system that functions as a to-do list from the ground up.
So instead of just firing off an email that says, hey, can you look at this? You'd have to be way more specific about what you need, when you need it, who's responsible.
Exactly. Imagine a world where, like, every email comes with built-in options for delegation, for deadlines, for clear expectations.
Yeah.
You no longer have to spend hours crafting the perfect, polite yet firm reminder email because it would all be built in.
Okay, I have to say, that does sound a lot less panic-inducing. But would people actually be willing to abandon email entirely? Like, it's so ingrained in how we work.
Well, think about it. We all share this pain. It's like this universal struggle with email overload.
Mhm.
If someone could truly solve this problem, and I mean really solve it,
People would be lining up to pay for it. He even suggests, like, people might pay $1,000 a month for a truly effective email replacement.
that's huge.
Yeah.
It really shows you how much we crave a better way to manage our digital lives.
For sure. It makes you realize just how valuable a truly innovative solution could be.
It's a classic example of disrupting an entrenched system by targeting a universal pain point.
I love it. All right, so we've tackled the untouchable Google. We've declared war on email. What other seemingly unshakable institutions are on Graham's hit list?
Hold on to your hats, because he's coming for higher education next.
Universities. Wow. It's almost like he's going down a checklist of the things we consider fundamental to society and saying, nope, we can do better. But I have to admit, I'm intrigued. How does he propose we rethink college as we know it?
Well, it starts with recognizing that the landscape of learning, it's shifting. A four-year degree, it's no longer the only path to success. Graham argues that a university's name, it's become a credential in itself,
Oh, for sure.
often overshadowing the actual skills and knowledge that people acquire. So he suggests we decouple credentials from institutions, allowing individuals to gain targeted knowledge and skills in a more efficient and, importantly, affordable way.
Yeah, that resonates with a lot of people, especially with the rising cost of tuition, the rise of online learning platforms. It feels like there's this gap between what the traditional university system offers and what the modern workforce actually needs.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that education, it's not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. By offering more flexible, specialized learning paths, we can empower individuals to tailor their education to their unique goals and passions.
It's almost like approaching education with a startup mentality, identifying a need, creating a solution, and constantly adapting to the changing landscape.
Exactly. And just as a successful startup can disrupt an entire industry, a reimagined approach to education could empower a generation to learn, grow, and contribute in ways we can only begin to imagine. But Graham doesn't stop at education. He then sets his sights on the world of entertainment, specifically what he calls internet drama. He basically throws down a challenge. Who's going to be the one to disrupt Hollywood?
No, that's an interesting thought. With streaming services already changing how we consume movies and TV, it feels like the entertainment industry is ripe for disruption. So what's Graham's vision for the future of storytelling?
He believes the future is online, and it's in long-form content. He envisions a world where online content isn't just an alternative to traditional media, it is the main event. And he's not talking about short YouTube clips or viral videos. He's thinking bigger. Think high-quality, long-form dramas, series, even movies, created specifically for online audiences.
So not just putting traditional TV shows online, but creating a whole new kind of storytelling experience designed specifically for the internet.
Exactly. And this raises an important question. Who will be the gatekeepers in this new world of online entertainment? Will it be the existing platforms like your Netflixes and your Apples? Or will new players emerge, offering a more direct connection between creators and audiences?
It's like the Wild West of entertainment, with a whole new frontier opening up. There's so much potential for innovation, both in terms of the content itself and the ways in which it's delivered and consumed.
And with the right approach, The right blend of creativity and technological savvy, someone could capture the hearts and minds of a generation hungry for engaging, thought-provoking content.
So we've tackled conquering the internet, revolutionizing communication, reinventing education, and now disrupting Hollywood. Is there anything left for Graham to tackle?
You underestimate his ambition. He then dives into the world of hardware, issuing a challenge to find the next Steve Jobs.
Okay, those are some big shoes to fill, but it makes sense. With Apple seemingly losing its innovative edge, who will step up to create the next generation of iconic hardware?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Graham believes that true hardware innovation is most likely to come from startups, not existing tech giants. He argues that large companies, for all their resources, they often become bogged down by bureaucracy and risk aversion. They're less likely to take the kind of bold, unconventional bets that lead to truly groundbreaking products.
It's the classic David and Goliath story. The nimble startup, driven by passion and a clear vision, taking on the lumbering giant, burdened by legacy systems and a fear of failure. And in the world of tech, we've seen that story play out time and time again.
Think about it. No one could have predicted Apple's rise to dominance. They were the scrappy upstarts, not the established players.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most disruptive ideas, they come from those who are willing to challenge the status quo, who aren't afraid to fail, to experiment, to think differently. And who knows, maybe the next Steve Jobs is out there right now, tinkering away in their garage, dreaming up a product that will change the world.
And if they can embrace that fear factor, that sense of unease that tells them they're onto something truly different, something truly special, they just might succeed.
It's pretty inspiring to think that somewhere out there, the seeds of the next technological revolution are being planted. But let's be honest, it's also a little intimidating. If these big, ambitious ideas are the ones with the most potential, how do we even begin to tackle them? It feels like we're talking about changing the world, and that's a lot of pressure.
That's where Graham's advice really shines. He reminds us that we don't need to start with a perfectly formed plan to conquer the world. In fact, it's better if we don't.
You're saying it's okay to start small, even if our ultimate goal is to, say, reinvent education or healthcare.
Exactly. Don't get bogged down trying to create the ultimate perfect solution right out of the gate. Instead of announcing you're here to replace Google or disrupt Hollywood, focus on a specific problem, a specific group of users, and let your solution speak for itself.
So it's less about having a detailed roadmap and more about setting a clear direction than adapting as you go.
Precisely. Remember Columbus. He didn't set out to discover America. He was trying to find a new trade route to the east. It was during that journey that he stumbled upon something even bigger than he could have imagined.
That's a great analogy. So if we apply that to, say, reinventing email, we wouldn't necessarily start by declaring war on email itself. Instead, we might create a better to-do list app, one that addresses those core frustrations of email overload. Then let users make the connection themselves.
Exactly. Focus on solving a real problem for a specific group of users. If your solution is truly innovative, people will take notice. Microsoft didn't start by trying to dominate the PC market. They started by building a programming language for a specific type of computer. Facebook started as a way for Harvard students to connect with each other.
You know, it's funny how often those world-changing ideas start with a simple, even seemingly trivial problem to solve. I think that's a really encouraging thought for anyone feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the challenges we've been discussing today.
It's a powerful reminder that the next big thing might not look so big at first. It might start as a solution to a niche problem, a way to make a small group of people's lives a little bit easier. But with the right mix of vision, execution, and a little bit of luck, that small solution could blossom into something truly extraordinary.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these frighteningly ambitious startup ideas, I think the key takeaway is this. The future isn't predetermined. It's not a set path we're destined to follow, but a landscape of possibilities waiting to be explored.
And while the challenges we face might seem daunting, even terrifying at times, they also present incredible opportunities for innovation and progress.
It's about embracing that fear factor we talked about earlier, that sense of unease, of being a little bit scared, is often a sign that we're on the right track, that we're pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
So to our listeners out there, if you encounter an idea that seems impossibly ambitious, don't shy away from it. Lean into that fear. Embrace the unknown. You might just surprise yourself with what you can achieve.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time for more explorations into the world of ideas that make us think differently and inspire us to create the future we want to see.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into some, well, pretty crucial advice for anyone looking to build a successful startup, and it comes straight from the source. Paul Graham, a name that's practically synonymous with startups,
Definitely.
he co-founded Y Combinator, and for those who are new to this whole world, it's basically the Harvard of startup accelerators.
Yeah, they've had a hand in launching some of the biggest names out there.
We're talking Airbnb, Dropbox, Stripe, companies that started as these scrappy little startups and became, well, household names.
And Graham wasn't just some passive observer, watching from the sidelines. He spent nearly a decade leading Y Combinator, mentoring a whole generation of founders.
Exactly. So he's seen it all, from the million-dollar ideas to the, shall we say, the not-so-million-dollar ideas.
Let's just say he's got a pretty good grasp of what works and what doesn't.
He's seen it all. And the best part, he's distilled all those years of wisdom into this incredibly insightful essay called Before the Startup, which is what we're diving into today.
And it's a doozy. He doesn't exactly hold back.
Oh, no, not at all. He throws out the traditional playbook and challenges a lot of assumptions people make about building a successful company. Like, get this, one of his central points is that when it comes to startups, your experience might actually be your biggest liability.
It's like trying to play basketball with a tennis racket. You might be a pro in your own field, but those skills don't always translate to the fast-paced, ever-changing world of startups.
He makes this really interesting analogy to, of all things, skiing. Imagine you're at the top of a mountain, fresh powder, ready to shred. Naturally, you'd want to lean back to slow down, right? It seems intuitive.
But on skis, that's like the worst thing you can do. You'll wipe out.
Exactly. And Graham says that's the same mistake a lot of people make when they enter the startup world. They rely on instincts that have been honed in a completely different environment, like large, established companies, where the rules are clear, the pace is predictable.
And those instincts can be disastrous in a startup, where adaptability and a willingness to learn on the fly are way more valuable than years of experience in a different setting.
Yeah, you've got to be ready to pivot and adjust constantly. He talks about how he and the other Y Combinator partners would constantly warn founders about these common pitfalls. It often went in one ear and out the other.
They just wouldn't listen. They'd come back a year later, tails between their legs, saying, "Why didn't we listen?" Which I guess just proves his point, right? That the startup world operates on this whole different set of rules.
Rules that often defy our initial instincts, the things we think we know.
Now, here's where things get interesting. While Graham encourages you to question most of your assumptions, there's one area where he says you should absolutely trust your gut.
Choosing your team.
Exactly. And this applies to everyone, your co-founders, your early employees, even those superstar investors with the perfect track record on paper. Graham emphasizes that if something feels off, if your intuition is screaming, "Danger!" you need to listen to it.
Because let's be real, building a startup is like stepping into a pressure cooker. You're working crazy hours, facing constant uncertainty, problem solving on the fly. You need a team you can trust implicitly. People who not only share your vision, but your values as well.
Absolutely. People who'll be there to support you when things get tough, and trust me, they will.
No doubt about it. And Graham argues that misaligned incentives or a lack of trust within the founding team, that can be absolutely fatal for a startup.
It's like a crack in the foundation. It might seem small at first, but it can bring the whole thing crumbling down.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of questioning your assumptions and trusting your gut when it comes to people. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, what about all the technical stuff, the business jargon, the convertible notes, all of that? Should I be an expert on all of that before I even start?
It's a common concern, and it's fascinating how Graham tackles it because he has a very unconventional take on it.
He basically says, don't sweat it. And he's not saying you shouldn't learn about that stuff eventually, but his point is that your energy, especially in the beginning, is better spent elsewhere.
It's all about maximizing your learning. Oh, that's why we're all here on the deep dive.
Exactly. So instead of getting bogged down in the weeds of startup jargon, Graham says focus on becoming an expert in something much more crucial.
Your users.
Bingo. Forget about mastering the perfect pitch deck or memorizing legal terms. You can always bring in lawyers and mentors for that later on. Your superpower, the thing that will truly set you apart, is a deep, almost obsessive understanding of your users and the problem you're trying to solve for them.
Think about Mark Zuckerberg when he started Facebook. He wasn't some business prodigy. He was a Harvard student who understood his target audience, in this case, his fellow students, and their desire to connect.
He tapped into this fundamental human need, And that's what fueled Facebook's explosive growth early on.
It wasn't about some genius business acumen. It was about understanding his users on a deep level.
Okay, so we've established that startups are weird, your instincts might be wrong, trust your gut with people, and become an expert on your users, not necessarily startups themselves. What else does this startup guru have to say?
Well, this next point is a big one, and it really challenges that whole hustle mentality that's so prevalent in the startup world these days.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Graham argues that with startups, you can't just game the system your way to success. You can't just hack it.
Oh, I love that. It's so refreshing, especially in a world obsessed with shortcuts and quick fixes. There's no magic bullet.
Exactly. He compares startups to physics, you know? You can't trick the laws of physics, and you can't trick your way to a successful startup.
You can't just fake it till you make it in this game.
Not if you're playing the long game. Think about a time you were truly blown away by a product or service. What was it that impressed you? It wasn't some clever marketing ploy, was it? It was probably that it actually solved a problem you had.
Yeah, like someone finally gets it, someone finally understands what I need.
Right. And that's exactly what Graham says is so crucial for a successful startup. Really deeply understanding your users. And this brings us to maybe his most important point for anyone thinking about becoming an entrepreneur. It's not just about a brilliant idea.
Or even having a great team.
It goes beyond that. It's up being ready for the sacrifices that come with it. He doesn't try to sugarcoat it. Graham actually compares starting a company to, get this, having kids.
Okay, so sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, that's what I'm picturing.
Well, maybe not exactly like that, but he does say it's like pushing a button that completely changes your life, and there's no going back.
No more like lazy Sundays or jetting off on vacation at a moment's notice.
Let's just say flexible takes on a whole new meaning in the startup world. He uses Larry Page as an example, the Google co-founder.
Talk about someone who's found a ridiculous amount of success.
Even Page, with all his accomplishments, admits that running a company like Google never really stops. It's this constant flow of solving problems and making decisions nonstop.
So it's exciting, sure, but also kind of terrifying, right? That this thing, your startup, can basically take over your life for years, maybe longer. I feel like it takes a certain personality type to really thrive in that environment, someone almost obsessed.
That's exactly Graham's point. This isn't for everyone. And that's completely okay. There's zero shame in choosing a different path, one that gives you more balance and personal freedom.
You have to be honest with yourself. What are your limits? What's important to you? And what are you actually willing to give up? And, speaking of knowing yourself, Graham has some very specific advice about when you shouldn't start a company.
He's not buying into that whole college dropout turned billionaire myth, is he?
Not one bit. He practically calls out universities for handing out entrepreneurship brochures alongside contraception information in their welcome packets. It's like, pick your path, kids.
Right. A little ironic, isn't it?
Totally. But on a more serious note, what he's saying makes a lot of sense. College is a time to explore, to dive into things that interest you. It's not about launching companies and chasing investors.
Remember those late-night study sessions in college? Fueled by pure curiosity and probably way too much coffee. That's the energy you want to hold on to during those years. Graham's point is, college is a unique time for a reason. It's all about exploring without limits.
So if college isn't the time to be launching a startup, when is? And how do you even stumble upon one of those million-dollar ideas that everyone seems to be after?
Get ready for this. Graham actually thinks the absolute worst thing you can do is actively search for startup ideas.
It's like when you lose your keys, and the harder you look, the less likely you are to find them, right?
Okay.
So you're telling me you shouldn't go looking for that billion-dollar idea. How's it supposed to work then?
It's about creating the right environment in your mind, a place where those ideas can naturally pop up. Graham calls it making your mind the type that startup ideas form in without any conscious effort.
So not some mystical process, but more like setting the stage, creating fertile ground.
Exactly. A lot of the best startup ideas actually come up naturally, not from some forced brainstorming session. They come from a place of genuine curiosity, that deep desire to solve a problem you've experienced or seen in the world.
Kind of like those passion projects that people pour their heart into, and sometimes they turn into something much, much bigger.
Exactly. Think about Apple, Yahoo, Google, Facebook. None of those were meant to be huge companies at first. They started as side projects, something someone was passionate about, wanting to make things better and fix a problem.
It's that saying, do what you love, and the money will follow.
It's just that Graham takes it even further. He believes that when you completely immerse yourself in those things you're curious about, that's how you create the perfect conditions for amazing ideas. It's about going deep, becoming an expert on anything that truly fascinates you.
So not about chasing what's trending or predicting the next big thing, more like really dive into your own passions and see what comes up.
Exactly. Within that mastery, that deep well of knowledge, that's where those aha moments come from, the insights that can change entire industries.
And you can say Graham's a perfect example of that, right? He didn't wake up one day and decide to create the world's most famous startup accelerator. Y Combinator came from his own curiosity, from wanting to support founders who were tackling problems he personally found fascinating.
He discovered a winning formula, not through some master plan, but by following his interest and trusting his intuition.
Which brings us back to his core message, the one he repeats throughout the essay. Ready for it.
Hit me.
Just learn.
Seems so simple, yet so powerful when you think about it.
It really is. In a world that's obsessed with shortcuts and hacks, Graham's reminding us that real success, especially for startups, comes from knowledge, expertise, and truly understanding the problem you're trying to solve.
It's about embracing being a learner, which, if we're being honest, is probably what brought you to the deep dive in the first place,
Yeah.
right?
It's about approaching everything with that sense of wonder, you know? Always wanting to learn something new and see things from different angles.
Because let's be honest, in the startup world especially, the more you know, the better your chances of spotting those game-changing opportunities.
It's like Graham saying, forget about the trends, forget about gaming the system. He actually thinks that people who want to be founders now might be better off with a traditional liberal arts education.
Which on the surface seems kind of strange in this whole tech-driven world, doesn't it? But his whole point is that it's not about racking up credentials or becoming a master of one specific skill.
It's more about that intellectual flexibility, right?
Yeah.
Being able to learn things quickly, adapt to new information, and most importantly, use all that to actually solve problems in the real world.
Exactly. Which brings us to this really thought-provoking question that Graham asks at the end of his essay. It's something we want you to really think about as you continue on your own deep dive into this whole startup world.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
He asks, and I'm paraphrasing here, when you picture the most fulfilling work life you can imagine, how do you see yourself winning?
Wow, that's a big question.
It really gets at the heart of what motivates us, don't you think? What are we actually working toward, both in our careers and our lives in general? Is it really about building some billion-dollar company? Or is it something more than that, something with more personal meaning?
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Building a successful startup, it's obviously not all about the money, is it?
It's about making a real difference, creating something that has a lasting impact.
And the people who really find success, they're not just chasing profits.
They want to solve real problems, make things better. They leave their mark on the world.
That's a great point. And, as you continue on your own journey, whichever path you decide to take, keep that question in mind. Let it help guide you, your decisions, and how you personally define success.
Because who knows, maybe one day we'll be lucky enough to have you on the deep dive, sharing your wisdom with the next generation of innovators and change makers.
From listener to legendary founder. Now that's a story.
Definitely one for the books.
And on that inspiring note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Paul Graham. If you haven't already, do yourself a favor and check out his essay, Before the Startup. You can find the link in our show notes.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Welcome, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of startups with, well, let's call it a reality check from Paul Graham's 18 Mistakes That Kill Startups.
We all love a good success story, but honestly, failures, those are the real treasure maps.
And Graham's seen a few, right? With his experience at Y Combinator, he doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, he doesn't. And this deep dive is about deciphering that map he's giving us, understanding those pitfalls so we can, well, avoid them.
He jumps right into the very first thing, the one mistake, as he puts it, that can doom a startup.
Not making something users actually want.
Which seems obvious, but you'd be surprised.
It's easy to get blinded by your own idea. We fall in love with the what without stopping to ask, but does anyone else even need this?
Like those early online stores, right? Graham talks about how they had this whole internet shopping thing down, but then...
Completely dropped the ball in back end.
Yeah.
Order processing.
Right.
Crickets. Good thing Graham's own startup was there to step in.
See, that's the thing. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know until it's too late.
Exactly. And that leads us to another pitfall Graham points out. Location, location, location.
Like where you set up shop really matters.
Hugely. Think Silicon Valley. Why is it still such a powerhouse?
Because that's where all the...
It's where the expertise is concentrated.
Mhm.
Talent draws talent, which draws opportunity. It's a cycle. Now think about your industry. The really groundbreaking stuff, where's it coming from?
Usually it is a few main hubs, yeah.
Right, so being in the right place, surrounded by the right people, that matters. Now here's a question.
Mm.
Where's the sixth largest center in the U.S. for listeners' industry?
Honestly, no clue.
And that right there speaks volumes. It's probably dwarfed by those top dogs, proving how crucial location can be.
Okay, so you've got solve a real problem, we've got location. What else? What other traps should we be watching out for?
Let's talk about those Me Too ideas. It's like Facebook, but
Yeah, I get it.
Graham saw this a lot. And what he realized was the truly successful startups, they weren't copycats. They came from a founder's own need.
The whole scratch your own itch thing.
Exactly. But here's where it gets tricky. The startup world loves to preach. Stick to your vision.
Right. Never give up, all that.
And persistence is vital, but unlike, say, winning a race, a startup needs flexibility. You have to be willing to follow the data, even if it means changing course. Sometimes sticking to your guns too hard, it backfires.
So it's less a straight line and more like constant experiments.
Precisely. Always testing, iterating. Sometimes you have to admit the original idea wasn't perfect. Like that whole thing with kids and balls, remember that?
Wait, what?
In the article? About how little kids, they're often scared to catch a ball.
Oh, right, right.
Graham uses that to show how some founders, they pick small, safe projects because they're afraid of competition. They don't want to even try for the ball.
Because if it's good, someone's going to try and take it from you anyway.
Exactly. Trying to avoid competition usually means you're avoiding a great idea. So here's a thought.
Mhm.
What's a startup someone ELE should build? Something you'd use but wouldn't make yourself.
Ooh, that's a good one. Let me think on that. But while I do, can we talk about the team? Building the right team seems crucial.
Absolutely. And Graham gets real about this, especially when it comes to programmers.
Makes sense given how much relies on tech these days.
He saw it firsthand during the dot-com bubble. Back then, a lot of startups crashed and burned because they didn't have that strong tech foundation. Business sense? Sure.
Yeah.
But the technical chops? Not so much.
So you can't just hire anyone who knows code and hope for the best.
Exactly. And if you're not a tech person yourself, well, it can be hard to tell who's who in that world.
So how do you solve that? If you're not a tech person, how do you even begin to know who to hire?
Graham actually has a clever little trick for this one. He says, go to a top computer science department and see what platforms they're using for research.
The idea being if it's good enough for them.
It's probably a safe bet for a startup. Having a tech person on your team, that's ideal, but even if you don't, this gives you a starting point.
Little peek behind the curtain to see what the pros are using. Speaking of which, let's talk funding. We all know startups need cash, but how much is too much? Or too little?
It's a tightrope walk for sure. Graham uses this metaphor of a runway, right?
Runway, like for...
Exactly. Your funding, that's your runway. It represents how long you've got to get off the ground, metaphorically speaking, before the money runs out.
And nobody wants to be caught short of the...
Crash landing, exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Too little money, you're in trouble. Too much, and you're in trouble.
Okay, too little I get. No fuel, can't fly, but too much. How's that a bad thing?
Pressure. To grow fast, sometimes too fast. Makes it harder to pivot if you need to.
Because now you're beholden to...
Investors, who may have a very different vision than your users do, and once you've taken that big investment, you're not just answering to yourself anymore.
Right, there's a board, maybe, or...
Speaking of which, remember when Apple's board fired Steve Jobs?
Wild, right? Hard to imagine letting someone like that go.
Proves even the best can clash with investors. Sometimes those investors, even with good intentions, they make decisions that, well, let's just say it's a cautionary tale.
Finding that sweet spot with funding then. Not too little, not too much. Just enough to actually get you somewhere. Which I guess ties into this whole thing of building a product people love versus, actually making money. Are those always at odds?
It's the eternal startup struggle. You need something people want, but you also need a business.
Yeah.
But Graham says, worry about monetizing too early and you might actually kill the whole thing.
Because you're so focused on the money, you forget to make it.
Good. Exactly. It's backwards. He says, prioritize value for the user. Solve the problem incredibly well. The money will follow.
Like Google. Figured out the whole search thing first then.
Ads later. Exactly. They didn't let the pressure to make money overshadow the mission. And it worked out okay for them. This also ties into another thing Graham talks about. Real artist ship. Heard that one.
Get it out there, even if it's not perfect.
Right. But there's a balance. You don't want to launch something half-baked, but waiting too long, that can be just as bad. It's about finding that sweet spot. Launching quickly enough to get feedback, but not so quickly that you put out something.
Subpar. Yeah, it's tricky.
It is. And that's where user feedback is key. Get it in front of them early, iterate. Don't be afraid to make changes.
Find those early adopters who are in it for the ride. Which, speaking of, Graham doesn't downplay the hard work involved, does he?
Not at all. He even encourages founders to get their hands dirty, even if it's stuff they hate. He tells this story, right, about this one founder who spent half his time doing something most tech people would dread.
Which is?
Talking to suits, executives at cell phone companies.
Well, the humanity.
Yeah. But this guy, he was willing to do whatever it took to get his product in front of the right people. And that, Graham says, is huge.
That hustle, that willingness to do what needs to be done. So for everyone listening who's thinking about taking the leap, I guess what Graham's saying is, are you really in it?
For the long haul. Because it's not easy. It's not for everyone.
It's like that saying, right? Jumping off a cliff and building your wings on the way down.
Perfect analogy. And while Graham focuses on what can go wrong, I think his message is ultimately hopeful. It's like he's saying, look, it's tough, but doable. Learn from others, put in the work. You might just surprise yourself.
Try hard, don't give up. And hey, even Steve Jobs got fired once.
True. But think about it. If Apple, with all its resources, can make mistakes, then it's okay if the rest of us stumble along the way too.
As long as we get back up, right, learn and keep moving. But before we wrap this up, one last thing. Graham talks about all these success stories, but did any of them actually get it right on the first try? Or did they all have to, adapt as they went?
That is the question, and I think it's worth pondering. Think about a recent successful startup, anyone. Did they nail their original vision exactly? Or did they have to pivot, adjust, maybe completely reinvent themselves along the way?
Good point. A lot to think about.
As there should be. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But the right mindset, a healthy dose of cautionary tales like these, that's a good start.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. The wrong platform, too much money, enough to make anyone want to stick with their day job.
But Graham's not trying to scare anyone off. He's giving us the tools to avoid those traps.
Like having a guide through a jungle.
Exactly. And knowing the dangers is half the battle. That's why he stresses good programmers, the right platform, being smart with investors.
Being smart in general.
Because in the startup world, those small details, they can be the difference between success and failure.
It's not about being perfect. It's about learning, adapting.
That's the beauty of it, though, right? Startups aren't static. They're alive. They respond. They evolve.
So as we wrap up, any final takeaways you want to leave people with?
Number one, making something users actually want. That's it. That's the foundation.
The golden rule.
And number two, you're not alone. We all have those Me Too ideas, those moments of doubt, those times when we want to give up.
We've all been there.
Exactly. That's why hearing these stories, learning from each other, it's so crucial. We've got Graham's guideposts to help us navigate this crazy world.
Okay, so you sent over those excerpts from Paul Graham's essay, Why to Not Start a Startup. And I gotta say, it sounds like you're at a crossroads.
A big decision on the horizon to take the leap or play it safe.
Exactly, and it is a big one. Well, Paul Graham, founder of Y Combinator, he's seen thousands of startups.
It has.
So this essay, it's like a window into all those doubts, the fears, but also that exhilaration.
That's building something new.
Yeah, and one thing that jumped out at me right away was Graham's take on age.
Yeah.
We think
Big factor, right?
huge, like is there a cutoff? But
Yeah.
Graham, he flips the script.
You did.
He says it's not about the number, it's about a mental shift.
It's about how you think.
Yeah, like he talks about Sam Altman, youngest founder at Y Combinator at 19.
19, can you imagine?
But Graham says Altman had this maturity.
Like a 40-year-old.
So what's the takeaway for, someone listening who's maybe not a prodigy?
Right, like how do we measure up?
Well, Graham lays out these tests for what he calls adult thinking.
Okay.
He talks about this thing called the kid flake reflex, which is basically that urge to avoid tough stuff and just go for the easy route.
We've all been there.
Oh yeah, big time.
So how does that play out in the startup world?
Well, Graham says adults are expected to handle the hard stuff head on, even when it's the last thing they want to do.
And let's be honest, startups are full of those moments.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So think about a time you felt that kid flake reflex, listener's name. Like, what was it about that situation that made you want to just
Wow.
nope out?
It's a powerful question to consider.
And you know what's interesting? Graham says even having a lack of experience, it shouldn't hold you back.
Really? You'd think that would be essential.
I know, right? But he argues startups, they're like crash courses in learning.
You're thrown in the deep end.
Exactly, way more so than a traditional job.
So it's about the rate of learning being off the charts,
You have to adapt fast.
which in the long run
Huge
is
advantage.
absolutely huge.
Like he gives that example of Kiko, their first startup totally tanked. But they took those lessons and launched Justin.tv, which was massive.
See, failure isn't always the end.
So we've talked about age experience, but then there's the big one.
The million-dollar idea.
Right, you'd think you need some groundbreaking concept to even consider starting a company.
Makes sense.
But Graham says something pretty bold here.
What's that?
He says the founders themselves are more important than the initial idea.
Wow, so it's more about the people.
It's about their ability to build, to learn, to pivot.
Interesting.
Like Y Combinator, they've even funded startups where the founders didn't have a concrete idea at first.
They just saw potential in the people.
They saw that drive, that ability to execute.
So it takes the pressure off finding that perfect idea from day one.
Exactly.
It's more about, like Graham says, focusing on what you're good at making.
And solving problems maybe even in your own life.
Yeah, like what's something you're facing listeners' name that you wish there was a solution for?
Because often those personal pain points, they can spark some incredible innovations.
It's about authenticity too, right?
Yeah.
When you're passionate about solving a problem, it shows.
Okay, but let's get real for a sec. What about those common fears, the what-ifs that keep people up at night?
The I don't know enough about business fear. The what if I can't find a technical co-founder fear.
All of it. And Graham tackles them head on.
So what's the verdict?
He says these fears, often way overblown.
Easier said than done, right?
Sure, but action beats overthinking every time.
He's seen it firsthand.
Countless times, founders pushing through those doubts, taking the leap, and figuring it out as they go.
So instead of getting stuck in those what-ifs,
Graham wants us to question the default.
the default.
Yeah, like he goes as far as comparing the current job market to medieval serfdom.
Whoa, that's a strong comparison.
It is, but it makes you think, right? Is a traditional job the only path?
So is he suggesting there's a shift happening?
He thinks we might be on the edge of one.
Interesting, like how so?
Like back when things went from agrarian to industrious. Imagine telling someone back then, hey, leave the farm and go work in a factory.
They'd probably think you were crazy.
Right. But that shift happened, and Graham thinks startups, they're at the forefront of something similar.
A new era of work.
Maybe, but he also knows starting a company isn't for everyone.
There are valid reasons to hesitate.
Of course, so let's dig into those.
Okay, let's do it.
Like, what are some of those reasons someone might hit the brakes on that startup dream?
Well, family, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Graham talks about that. Big life changes, financial security. He gets it. Those things matter. Even the need for structure. Some people, they thrive in that environment.
It's true. Startups, they can be chaotic.
And that's putting it mildly. There's this one point he makes that really stuck with me. He talks about being independently wealthy. And he basically says, if you don't need the money, why push yourself through the startup ringer?
He's being serious.
Dead serious. He even admits that's why he's not starting another company right now.
Wow, okay, so even a startup guru like Paul Graham recognizes it's not always the right move.
Exactly. It's about knowing yourself, what makes you tick. Do you crave structure, clear expectations?
Because startups, not exactly known for those things.
Not even close. He uses the analogy of a soccer team, everyone's running around making decisions on the fly.
No one's micromanaging every pass, every shot.
Exactly. It's about trust, a shared vision. And that might not be for everyone, and that's okay.
So if anyone's listening and thinking, okay, startups maybe not for me, what's the takeaway?
I think it goes back to questioning those defaults, like Graham talks about. Just because everyone says, go get a traditional job, climb that ladder,
Yeah.
he's asking, is that the only way?
So what's he looking for? If he and Y Combinator are betting on founders, what are the signs?
You know, it's funny. It's less about the initial idea and more about the person. Can they build? Can they learn? Have they overcome challenges before?
So it's that track record of resilience, of getting back up after a stumble.
Exactly. They're not chasing trends. They're looking for those core qualities that spell success long term.
So it's not just about having a light bulb moment. It's about what you do with that light bulb.
And even with all the right ingredients in place, he's honest about the odds. Most startups, they don't become the next Google.
That's got to be tough, right? Putting in all that work and still facing those long odds.
It is. But that's where Graham's perspective on failure comes in. It's not the end of the road.
Okay, so how do we reframe that?
He talks about successful failures, meaning you might not hit that initial grand slam, but you learn, you adapt, and those lessons, they become like gold.
So future employers, investors, they see that experience as a plus.
Huge plus. It's street cred. You've been in the trenches, you know what it takes.
So instead of this fear of failure, it's almost like a badge of honor.
In a way, it's about embracing the unknown, expecting to stumble along the way.
And maybe that's what needs to change in our approach to work in general, right? Not just startups.
It's a mindset shift. Because the truth is, things rarely go perfectly according to plan.
So true. So then what are we left with? What's that core message Graham wants us to walk away with?
That we're on the cusp of something big. Just like those farmers who dared to leave for the cities, we're seeing the traditional model of work being challenged.
And startups, they're leading the charge.
But it's not just about building companies. It's about reclaiming that sense of agency, that entrepreneurial spirit that pushes us to create, to innovate, to make a difference. And that's exciting.
It is exciting, but even with all this talk about the future, Graham doesn't sugarcoat it. Startup life. It's not for the faint of heart. It's funny, right? We talk about startups and we picture those ping pong tables and beanbag chairs.
Idea factories, everyone's brainstorming the next big thing.
Yeah, and then boom, overnight success story. But Graham's like, hold on a sec.
There's a whole lot of, let's call it unglamorous stuff in between.
He doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
Not one bit. He's all about that schlep mentality.
Hustle the grind.
Because even with all this talk about a new era of work, the fundamentals, they haven't vanished.
Hard work, perseverance, those are still the price of entry.
Exactly. You got to be willing to roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, face those inevitable setbacks.
And honestly, that's what makes his take so refreshing.
It's not some romanticized version of entrepreneurship. It's the real deal, warts and all.
Exactly. It's that balance, right?
Yeah.
Optimism, but with a healthy dose of realism.
You need both that hope of making a dent in the universe, but also knowing it's going to be a bumpy ride.
And sometimes that ride leads to wild success, a game changer.
And sometimes it's what he calls a successful failure.
What does that even mean?
So maybe you don't achieve that initial grand vision, but you learn invaluable lessons.
You come out stronger?
Way stronger, battle-tested. You know what you're capable of.
Makes you think, what if we all viewed failure that way? Not as the end, but as fuel for the next thing.
It would unlock so much potential if we weren't all terrified of messing up.
So as you're listening to this listener's name wrestling with this decision, remember Graham's point.
There's no right answer for everyone. It's about your values, your risk tolerance, where you want to go.
Maybe this deep dive sparked an idea, or maybe it gave you permission to question the default path.
Because let's face it, in a world that's constantly changing, staying stuck, that's the biggest risk of all.
And even if starting a company isn't in the cards right now, remember what we learned here.
We all have that capacity to be creators, to solve problems, to make a difference, whether it's in our own lives, our communities, or, yeah, maybe even a business idea.
It's that entrepreneurial spirit, that drive to build something meaningful, and that's powerful stuff.
It is, and who knows, maybe someday down the road, you'll be the one sharing your startup story.
And we'll be right here to hear all about it. Until then, keep asking those tough questions, keep pushing those boundaries, and keep that entrepreneurial spirit burning bright.
Because the world needs what you're building, even if you don't see it yet.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.